Hello and welcome to Adoreum Conversations. My name is Andrew Thomas, or Welsh Andy, as David called me. For those of you who don't know Adoreum, we're a worldwide community of business leaders, entrepreneurs, and creatives. Basically, we come together and we just join the dots for people. And now we're in isolation. We decided to do some podcasts. And a couple of weeks ago, David talked to the gorgeous Dr. Snay about the coronavirus. Marcus last week talked to Sarah Milne-Rowe. And I've got the unbelievable honor of speaking to a good friend of mine, James Doty, who's in California. Hi, Jim. You okay?
I'm wonderful.
For those of you who haven't read this book, which I've sent out to most of my friends, if you haven't got one, it's in the post. James Doty is a clinical professor in the Department of Neurosurgery at Stanford University. He's a neurosurgeon, he's an entrepreneur, and he's the director of CCARE, which is a Center for Compassion and Altruism Research at Stanford. I love that, Jim. That's amazing. How long have you started that? How long has that been going?
Believe it or not, almost 12 years. The interesting thing about that is that when I decided to actually start studying the field of compassion, if you will, and had a conversation with my colleagues in neuroscience and in psychology, I was actually met with derision in that it was felt that the study of compassion was a dead end in academia. And my hypothesis was at that time that compassion actually is one of the most important attributes of a human, and that it is from this base that all good things happen. And that, in fact, our physiology is actually such that when we are kind, compassionate care, it has a huge positive effect on both our mental and physical health. And subsequent to those conversations, I did not listen and proceeded to engage different individuals funding research in this area. And in fact, that hypothesis has been shown to be correct. What's interesting about this is essentially if you look at the work of, as an example, Karen Armstrong, who's an author, former nun, who's written about religion, and she's also the winner of the TED Prize in 2008. She started something called the Charter for Compassion, where she got together with, I believe, 19 spiritual and religious leaders who all agreed that at the basis of essentially every religion is compassion. And so what they knew intuitively and experientially, now science has demonstrated that, in fact, this is correct. And the reason is to care, to connect is part of our DNA, and it's allowed us to survive as a species.
How do you prove that research? You've had this going for 12 years. How do you kind of prove the point that compassion is that important, which I believe it is?
Well, what we know from science is that when an individual acts with intention compassionately, recognizing the suffering of another and intervenes or desires to intervene, the areas of the brain that are associated with reward actually are stimulated, and as well as the pleasure centers. So, and then a strange thing happens with your peripheral physiology. When you're in this mode of being kind and compassionate, it actually stimulates your vagus nerve, which is this large bundle of neurons that go from your brainstem throughout all the organs in your body. And it's a two-way highway with a lot of innervation into the heart. When you actually engage in compassionate action, your peripheral physiology functions better. Your blood pressure decreases, your heart rate variability increases, your immune system is boosted, the production of inflammatory proteins is decreased, and inflammation is associated with the occurrence of, the chronicity of, the severity of a variety of diseases. So there's a whole slew of physiologic effects in a positive way when one acts compassionately. And this engages what's called your parasympathetic nervous system, or your rest and digest system, versus your sympathetic nervous system, which many of us know is that part of our nervous system associated with fear, anxiety or the flight, fight, or freeze response. And right now, of course, in the presence of this pandemic, many people are fearful and anxious. And this type of anxiety and fear actually has a negative physiologic effect on you and depresses your immune system, actually, and potentially makes you more prone to get ill.
I'm going to do my Governor Cuomo here, Jim. Do you like this picture?
Yes.
So how did the Dalai Lama, how did you meet him, and how did he become a founding benefactor at the Institute? I love it, by the way. He looks very kutchy. That's a Welsh word, kutchy.
Yeah. Yes, kutchy.
You're kutchy. You're kutchy.
Yeah, exactly. Interestingly enough, I had begun this work with some very positive results. And this may seem strange, but I am an atheist and I had no interest in religion or spirituality at the time. And I was walking through the Stanford campus and I was in deep thought. And suddenly an image of the Dalai Lama popped into my head. And honestly, I couldn't shake it. And I was telling my wife about this. And what's funny is, a few years previously, and my wife was a big fan, or is a big fan of the Dalai Lama, she had tried to convince me to go to an event where he was visiting the Bay Area, and she bought 2 tickets. I actually refused to go. So what happened though is I couldn't.
You thought I'll just meet him.
Yeah, exactly. So I couldn't shake this, and what happened is that ultimately, it popped into my head that I should invite him to Stanford to have a discussion about compassion and the science that we were doing, because he has an interest in neuroscience. So he had visited Stanford previously. I tracked down the person who had invited him, which was the dean of the School of Medicine's wife, and through those connections was able to get an audience with him. And this audience was really scheduled for only 15 minutes. But he and I connected immediately. He immediately agreed to come to Stanford. We talked for about an hour and a half. We talked about different aspects of compassion and the brain. And at the end of it, he began an animated conversation with his primary English translator, a fellow by the name of Thupten Jinpa, who's a former monk. And at the end of the conversation, Jinpa, as he's known, turned to me and said, "Jim, His Holiness is so moved by this conversation and having met you that he would like to make a donation to your work." And at that moment, he gave, again, in our first meeting, the largest donation he's ever given to a non-Tibetan cause, which is quite extraordinary.
That's amazing. Is that him ringing you now?
Actually, it was.
Tell you're speaking to Andy.
Yes, exactly. I was just texting him that I can't talk. I'm with another great person in the world, and he's just going to have to wait.
He's going to have to wait.
But anyway, this began a relationship, and ultimately, actually, I became director or chairman of the Dalai Lama Foundation. He and I became friends, and ultimately did a number of events together. And really, it's been quite an extraordinary experience.
Listen, Jim, what I can't believe, you're a neurosurgeon, you're living in California, you're living the life. Where your beginnings, everybody must think that you came from, really well-to-do family. But reading your book, which I bought, like I said, for 40 odd of my friends, you explain the tough background you came from. For people who haven't read the book or don't know anything about you, would you mind explaining a little bit about your background and how you came to be interested in meditation and mindfulness?
So I think everyone who's listening has a past, and unfortunately, oftentimes people's past dictates their future, and that's for good or bad. And for myself, I grew up in a very difficult circumstance, as you mentioned. My father was an alcoholic. My mother had had a stroke when I was a child and was paralyzed, became chronically depressed, attempted suicide multiple times. My family was on public assistance essentially my entire life as a child. And for individuals to overcome those backgrounds, it's quite challenging. If you don't have mentors, if you don't have direction, if you don't have resources, both financial and family, it's really almost impossible to achieve what we call quote unquote success in life. When I was 12, I had a lot of anxiety, fear, anger, a sense of hopelessness and despair. And in the face of this, an event occurred which was transformative and changed the trajectory of my life. I actually walked into a magic shop, and thus the title, Into the Magic Shop, of my book, although I think in the UK it may be different.
It's the same in Wales.
Oh, okay, good. It's in different countries, it actually has different titles. So, anyway, that walking into the magic shop changed my life. And how it changed my life was that, interestingly enough, the owner, who knew all about magic, was not there, but his mother was there. And she knew nothing about magic. But what she did know about was people and how to connect with people. And here I was, this poor 12-year-old who was frightened and scared. And she greeted me with a embracing smile and a radiance of her personality. And what happens when an individual connects with another in this unconditional, embracing way is that it creates a sense of psychological safety. And in fact, we were talking a little earlier about physiology. When you are anxious, when you're fearful, when you have despair, this is when your sympathetic nervous system is stimulated, this flight or fight response. And when you grow up in an environment like I grew up, it's a form of constant trauma. And oftentimes, children who grow up in that environment have post-traumatic stress disorder. You have a chaotic life. You never know what's going to happen to you. And as a result, you're chronically stimulated in regard to your sympathetic nervous system because you have to be prepared for anything. And that's where my mind was living at that time. And in the face of that, it's very hard to concentrate. It's hard to, quote unquote, be present. And her greeting me in the manner she did made me immediately feel comfortable. And this is this shift from this fear mode to a safe mode. And so I immediately relaxed. She was actually quite insightful, asked me some challenging questions, which normally I would not answer. I answered them honestly. And at the end of about 20 minutes, she said to me, "I really like you. I'm here for another 6 weeks. And I think I could teach you something that might be really helpful for you." And thus began her and I meeting for about an hour and a half to 2 hours every day for 6 weeks. And that interaction fundamentally changed my life.
She taught you, as you call in the book, 4 tricks, 4 magic tricks.
Yes.
She's basically she was your private John Kabat-Zinn, was she?
Absolutely. And this, you have to remember, was before we had the term
1968, was it?
Pardon?
You said 1968 what this was?
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. It was 68. At that time, the term mindfulness was not used at all.
It was coined in Wales. Do you know that?
Oh, really?
Yeah. I'll send you some information.
Probably with Tibetan monks. It was also, there was the term neuroplasticity was not used. But what she taught me in this course of 6 weeks was, first of all, relaxing the body. And what happens when you're stressed and anxious is that you don't appreciate it, but your muscles are tense. You're always looking around. And so the first thing she taught me was what is now called a body survey in the mindfulness context. And with intention, you relax the muscles of your body, and then This is associated with the breathing technique, slowly breathing in and exhaling. And this also has the effect of shifting you from your sympathetic nervous system to your parasympathetic nervous system, this rest and digest mode. And when you're there, extraordinary things happen in your brain. One is that unlike being in survival mode, where you're looking at one way and the shortest way and the quickest way to get out of a situation, you now have access to your executive control function, which allows you to remember different experiences, to be much more thoughtful, discerning, and creative about your decisions. And that's very, very important. Additionally, when you're not afraid, it allows you now to actually interact with another in a very present sort of way. And the thing is, if you were to look at many people in modern society, 80% of them are not present. They are either focused on what happened in the past and what could have been, might have been, and should have been, or a future that has not yet occurred, but how they are visualizing the future. And as a result, they're not here. They're not directly interacting with an individual. And the problem is you can't have true human connection unless you're able to connect in that fashion. Because what happens for so many when they're in that mode is that they're projecting an image of how they want others to see them because they're afraid of being vulnerable or being judged. And the mere process of doing that takes a lot of psychic energy. And if you can't be authentic and vulnerable to the other, then they will not be that way to you. And in fact, when I give lectures and talks, I actually will get emotional. My voice will crack. I'll shed a tear. And it's clearly obvious that I'm being affected. Yeah. As soon as I do that, essentially everyone starts crying in the room. And the reason is because you're showing your authenticity, which allows them to be authentic and connect with deep emotion. And so many people are afraid of that, or afraid of being judged as being weak by showing those types of emotions. And what I would suggest is that when you're able actually to do that, that's an incredible sign of strength. I have no problem standing in front of thousands of people and showing that I care, or that I'm hurt, or that I'm vulnerable. And invariably, when I do that, actually people want to embrace me. They want to hug me. I cannot tell you the number of lectures I've given where at the end there are all these people lined up to hug me. And also because they're suffering and they want to be hugged. Yeah. But so that was the first lesson. And the second lesson, if you will, if I'm remembering correctly.
Taming the mind. Taming the mind.
Taming the mind. And the thing is that this aspect.
That's hard. That's really hard, isn't it? It's kind of, you call it a DJ in the book. It's like a DJ in your head.
Yes, you know.
I can't turn that bloody one off.
Yeah, well, exactly. And most of us can't. And in fact, this is that part of you that says you're not good enough, you're not smart enough, you're not worthy. And that resists actually accepting praise or feeling that you can be loved because you're not worthy of love. And it's almost a universal problem. And the reason is, what people don't realize is this is a part of our evolution. You know, when we evolved as a species, that is not a perfect process. And as a result, I call them brain bugs. Negative type of events stick with you because they're critical for your survival, while positive events don't, because you're relaxed and you feel good and you just accept that. Well, the side effect of this is that when you've heard somebody be critical, or you've interpreted a negative response towards you, which of course happens to all of us, they stick to you like glue. And while oftentimes the positive aspects you respond with Teflon to, where they just rub off. And so many people go through life carrying these attitudes that they repeat to themselves, this narrative. And as a result, when you believe a negative comment, that becomes a reality. If you say, I cannot, then that is absolutely correct. You cannot. And so many people, unfortunately, have carried this. And what I tell people is each of those comments is like building a wall of bricks around you. and you create your own prison, of which it's very, very hard to escape. And as you do this over and over again, that wall gets higher and it gets darker and it becomes more self-limiting. And what I tell people is that we have such extraordinary, immense power, we just don't appreciate it. And when you have these false narratives going on in your head, you limit your power, you give it away to this narrative. And as a result, so many people who are so capable and have such immense power within them don't exhibit it or don't gain access to it. And so what this woman taught me in this magic shop was this was a false narrative. It wasn't true. It wasn't me. And she made me understand that that was the case. And then she taught me, if you will, how to change the records that the DJ is playing, which is one of self-affirmation, one of acceptance, one of love, one of a belief that I could do anything and that I was worthy of success, because so many people are self-sabotaging because of this narrative.
Yeah.
And so in some ways, what I tell people is she allowed me to see the true nature of reality, which is to sort of clean the lens of the window so I could actually look out at them and see the beauty, the power, the possibilities that I had not been able to see before because of my limited vision. And for me, that was, again, transformative. And what's amazing is it's something that is available to all of us, which we don't appreciate. And once you start changing this mindset of from one of impossibility to one of unlimited possibilities, everything changes in your life.
That's amazing. That's amazing. So you're a 12-year-old. You're from a really, as you say, poor background. You're living in a small house, and you go home and you're listening to these Ruth telling you how to do this. Did you practice every day? How long did it take for it to kind of click into place? And do you think everybody can learn these in your 12 years of study of compassion? Because I've got a few friends of mine I've bought your book for. And, I just want to know, do you think everybody can learn these tricks?
Not everybody. And the challenge is, one, is that there's a percentage of people who are sociopaths or psychopaths, and they do not have the capacity to care or be empathetic to other situation. And these people actually, many of them have actually been found to have structural abnormalities in their brains. So that subset of people, and I would tell you they're probably disproportionately found within the finance community, unfortunately, and oftentimes leading companies because the manner in which success is gauged oftentimes is from ruthlessness and not caring and taking advantage of situations. And these are attributes that sociopaths that, but in the short term, that type of behavior can be beneficial, but in the long term, it is not. And, but beyond that subset of people and beyond a group of people who've been so damaged by the nature of their suffering, almost everyone else it can have a profound effect on. And even people who have suffered deeply, I would suggest to you, those that have survived that, oftentimes become very self-reflective, self-aware, compassionate. And so it's interesting because it sometimes bifurcates, and it bifurcates in one way in which people who have suffered deeply, they know what suffering's like. When they see another suffering, they feel that. And as a result, they function in a manner in which they try to alleviate suffering. The other subset of people, unfortunately, are people who've been hurt so much and they carry this anger about that hurt, and they have a perspective, well, I suffered, well, screw these people, I'm going to make them suffer, or I don't care because I have to protect myself. And the sad thing about that is they miss so much of the beauty of life and how caring for another person actually is very affirmative, and it affects your physiology in a positive way. So these people, they carry this anger, this hostility, which has a very negative effect on their physiology, and it actually creates a world of darkness, and they never get to see the beauty of the world. So that's taming the mind. Go ahead.
Yeah, the third trick, which is, I think, we'll lead it on to you, is opening the heart, which is something about, and what I love about what you talk about in the book is your story. It's a mindfulness book, but it's also your biography story. It's about self-compassion. That's something that I've learned over the last few years, that if you're not compassionate to yourself, you can't be compassionate to others.
Exactly. And that is the problem, is that, if you can't, and this gets back to this issue of taming the mind, if you beat yourself up all the time and you're very hypercritical and you feel you're not worthy, then it shades how you look at others. Because if you can't be kind to yourself, it's very difficult to be kind to other people. And as a result, you look at other people in a hypercritical way and are very judgmental. And as a result, it affects your relationships with people, because you're not trusting, you're not accepting. And again, it limits your possibilities. As I talk about in my book, when I changed how I saw myself, and when I changed how I interacted with the world changed how it interacted with me. Because, if you're filled with anger and hostility, the nature of how we evolved as a species allows us to intuit microfacial expressions, voice intonation, body habitus, even smells that alert us to the emotional state of other people. Yeah. And if you're hostile, if you're angry, if you're fearful, that then affects every interaction you have with another person. If you are calm, if you are open, if you have a smile, like this woman did in the magic shop, Ruth, then suddenly that calms you down. And in fact, I'm sure you have experienced, as probably everybody listening to this, a situation where you walk into a meeting and the person leading the meeting has a scowl on their face and their arms are crossed. That immediately sets the tone of the meeting, which is a fear-based meeting. Versus if the person is sitting there relaxed, they have a smile on their face, they greet you warmly, then that changes the entire narrative. That it creates a sense of psychological safety. And if you look at companies who switch from this fear-based narrative to one of, if you will, love, there's a dramatic increase in ultimately shareholder value. And a variety of studies have been done in this way. And in fact, Google, which is of course one of the most successful companies in the world, and they're very data-driven, they wanted to understand what makes a successful team or a successful leader. And what's interesting about that is that they spent $50 million to do this. And when Google first started, because of the nature of the founders, who are engineers and probably have some degrees of Asperger's syndrome, they're very academic. They basically would only hire people from, I think, 15 universities, the best in the world, and only in the top 5% of the class. Because, of course, from their perspective, that is what will allow for success. Strictly a numbers thing.
Yeah.
And as they expanded and acquired different companies, what happened is that they hired many employees from those companies who did not fulfill those criteria whatsoever. But these were successful companies that, in fact, they bought. And so when they did this data acquisition of what makes a successful leader, the data came out as follows. the correlation between what university you went to and your grade point average had zero correlation with success of a leader or a team. Zero, none. And in fact, domain experience had almost no impact whatsoever. You did not have to be an engineer to lead a team of engineers. The other interesting thing is, what turned out to be most important was actually creating a environment of psychological safety, where people felt that they could be honest and authentic. And this authenticity was critically important for the leader. And the other aspect was creating an environment where failure was not judged, in the sense that you tried to do something and it didn't work out, you were not beaten up for it. And so at the end of $50 million, they answered a question which I could have answered for them for absolutely free in 2 minutes.
Well, maybe 5 million.
Yeah, I would have taken, 5. 5 would have been a good number. But my point is that, I mean, frankly, anyone who understands human nature, who understands the neuroscience of compassion and empathy, this is obvious. And it's so unfortunate that this information is not embraced by every company. In fact, as you and I have been talking about recently, this idea of creating a compassionate company index that sits there and says, what are these attributes of a company that will allow for success? And I just mentioned them. And actually being able to, if you will, certify companies that are compassionate. There was a fellow in Australia who was a very successful CEO. I can't remember his first name. His last name is Carnes, C-A-I-R-N-S. But the interesting story about him is that, and I that's my dog you hear back there.
Oh, it's David Tabasol. He likes to bark.
Exactly. The interesting thing about this is that, as you probably know, in corporations, they do these 360 evaluations, right?
It's a great story in your book about this, isn't it? About the CEO.
Yeah. So in this case, though, he had this company come in and do a 360 evaluation of him and all of his employees. Now, of course, the one of him he thought would show how great he was, and that's why he allowed them to do it. But at the end of this, the results came back and they presented them to the CEO. And basically the statement was that your company has one of the most toxic environments we have ever seen in a company. His initial response was to fire these people because they didn't know what they were talking about.
Was this the White House?
What?
Was this the White House?
Unfortunately, that person has not come in yet, but we don't have to go there. But the interesting thing that happened is that he went home and he shared the results of this survey with his wife. And he said, these people say I'm arrogant, that I don't listen, that et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And he said, what do you think about that? And she said, they're right. And then he said, what are you talking about? They're right. Why haven't you ever told me this? And she said, I've been telling you this for 20 years, but you would never listen. And this, again, gets back to listening and being present, right?
Yeah.
And so what happened is this led him on a 3-year journey to change himself. And at the end of this period of time, several things happened. He did another 360 evaluation, and this time he came back as one of the best CEOs. There was a dramatic increase in productivity in the organization, a decrease in healthcare costs, a decrease in human resource costs, and a dramatic increase in stock price. And this shows you the opportunity here to lead, the difference between leading with fear and leading with love. And in fact, when this person was interviewed, he said that the only way he knew how to lead at the time was through fear, because he was fearful, he was terrified. And that's how he had learned to cope, by creating fear in others. In some ways, it's like the bully.
The bully,
The bully is damaged, is in pain, and he responds by inflicting pain on others. And once he gained this insight and self-awareness, it was transformative, and everything changed. And in fact, his relationship with his wife and children dramatically changed.
That's a great story. Yeah, we have been talking about the compassion index. I just think it's a great way, instead of share price, which as you know, look at the coronavirus now, the share prices have dropped all around the world, but the companies themselves haven't changed. The people are still there. And I think if there was another way to measure the success of a company, that would be a far better barometer, wouldn't it?
Well, I think that the other interesting thing about that is that change can come in different ways. One is you're forced to change, and the other is you choose to change. And oftentimes, as an example, if we look at what the CSR, what is this, corporate social responsibility, people implement this not because they want to, but because they feel they have to.
Yeah.
And as a result, they put a junior person with minimal funding to go do something that looks good makes us look good. Versus, if you will, someone wanting to change to not only improve themselves, but to improve the life of their employees, understanding that when they do that, it makes the corporation highly, highly effective, and usually highly profitable. But they have to understand that. And sometimes, as an example, let's say if we had this compassionate company index or certification, by offering this, where individuals who use these corporate services or buy from the corporation say, I would rather buy from them. As an example, in the medical profession, medical healthcare companies have done surveys that show if an individual believes he is going to a hospital where there is more compassionate care, where the physicians are more compassionate, they will pay more and travel further. And frankly, the same is true in the world of whether it's in stores, food stores, merchandise, etc. It's true. If you go to a place where you feel that you're cared for and that people are genuinely interested in helping you, you'll travel further and pay more. I was reading an article, again, where there was one company, and this is in the context of our present situation, there was one company that said, I'm not going to fire anybody for 3 months. I'm not taking any pay. I'm distributing what would have been dividends to our employees, and we're going to keep them on as long as we can. And even though it's going to cost us at this time, it's important because our employees are us. It makes us success, and we believe in them, and they're like family. Versus the other person, and this was from a guy who's worth over $1 billion, he basically fires everyone, no pay, no severance, nothing, takes away their benefits, while he still lives in his $20 million home and has $1 billion in the bank, and basically it's screw you. And who wants to be around people like that, or be involved in a company like that treats you like you're just another cog in a wheel that is easily replaced, versus saying, hey, listen, no matter where you are in our company, whether you're the guy who sweeps the floors or whether you're the CEO, we're in this together, you're part of a team, you're important to us, we care about you. I can always tell a good doctor, and the way I can tell a good doctor is there's a subset of doctors who walk on the floor, they're arrogant, they demean people, they don't know anyone's names, they're demanding. Or you see the doctor who walks in, he greets the person who is sweeping the floor, He greets the nurses. He thanks them because he knows that his success, everything that he does, is dependent on those people doing their job. Otherwise, he could not do his job. And that's how I look at my own situation as a neurosurgeon. It's important that I have a team of people who are present, believe in what I'm trying to do, and I hope that I always honor them and respect them and thank them for that. And, it's interesting. One time I was leaving a position where I had been the chief of a neuroscience program, and I was interviewing a neurosurgeon to take over. And we did a tour of the hospital. And when we walked into the hospital, the information lady greeted us, and she said, "Oh, Dr. Doty, I'm so sorry to hear you're leaving. Can I come and give you a hug?" So she comes, I hug her. We walk to the cafeteria, and there's a lady who works in the cafeteria who, when I'm there, she always brings me a latte. And she says, "Oh, Dr. Doty, it's so great to see you. Let me make that latte for you. And I saved you a chocolate croissant." And, we sit down. So then we go up to radiology, and this technician comes out. She says, I said, "Well, how's the baby?" Because she'd recently had a baby. She goes, "Oh, Dr. Doty, thank you for asking, and thank you for that beautiful gift you gave the baby." And she gives me a hug. We go to the intensive care unit. Nurse comes up and she goes, "Dr. Doty, thank you so much for taking care of my mother when she was ill, da 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 da." And then we finish up and we go to my office. And we sit down, and I said, "Well, what do you think of the tour?" And he goes, "What the fuck was that?" And I go, "No, seriously.
What's all the kitchen?"
Yeah, I go, "What are you talking about?" And he goes, "All that hugging and all that shit." And I literally looked at him incredulously, and I said to him, I said, "Well, my own experience in terms of leadership is that if you care for people, they will bend over backwards far more than what you could ever pay them by just being kind and thoughtful and seeing them as human beings and reaching out and doing things for them. And that really costs you nothing, essentially." And I said, "What is your leadership style?" And he says to me, he says, "Well, I say shit and they say where and how much." And I looked at him. No, and I looked at him. I said, "Well, it's obvious why you don't have a job, right?" And sadly, this is an attitude of some people.
The global pandemic we're in at the moment, do you think this will be a catalyst for change and compassion, and people be more compassionate? I feel it, but can we sustain it?
Well, I think we're at a unique place, and we have two choices. I think that for most people, they, both those who are quite affluent and who have benefited from a society that allows them to be affluent, realize that they cannot escape and that they're just like everyone else. So I think there's a potential for a great leveling and hopefully an awareness by those who are privileged that we have a responsibility for those who are less fortunate. And we need to refer back to the social contract. When people such as Mr. Trump somehow think that government is business, that's the wrong attitude. Now, he's never been a successful businessman, so I guess he believes non-successful business management is how you benefit people. Clearly, that's not the case. What benefits people in the context of government is looking at every person as an important part, and we have a responsibility to every person. We have a responsibility to the poor to give them shelter and food and opportunity, and we should not have a system that is so unequal that those who have benefited continue to disproportionately benefit. And when you use the type of terms, oftentimes this translates into, oh, well, you just want to redistribute income in this socialist world. And the fact of the matter is, the affluent have disproportionately benefited in an unfair way. It's not redistributing income, it's actually making it a fair and level playing field that everyone benefits. And I believe that that's an opportunity we have to more clearly realize that we're in this together, not only in a nation sense, but in a world sense, to say that what happens to you potentially happens to me. It's not China versus United States. It's how do we help humanity? And if you're in the United States and China needs help, we give them help. If you're in Wales and you're suffering, we will do what we can to benefit Wales. And understand that this is not us versus them, that we are all the same. And so when you start looking at the world, yeah, exactly. And if you look at the world that way, and if you develop enough self-awareness and insight and appreciate that there is not separation, but there's oneness, and you go down that path, then I think this is an incredible opportunity and a reminder of this reality. There is a subset of people who will use this to justify populism, nationalism, and separation. We see this happening in Hungary. On some level, we're seeing this happening in the United States. I am hopeful, though, that the masses will rise and say, this is not acceptable. This is not how the world needs to run. We need to have a world that seeks to have fairness and opportunity for everyone. And I think that will result in a world that we all want to live in, and not one that will result in our extinction.
We're going to take some questions from the Adoreum network. Jim's got 4% left in his battery, and he's going to go swimming. But we've got one question from Ed Dalton, which I love Ed. He must probably drinking a bottle of champagne right now. He says, what are the psychological impacts of the pandemic and associated isolation? And how will it impact us regenerating when the climate allows? He's American, by the way. He's from New York.
Well, I think there are two aspects of that. Of course, anytime where there's uncertainty, this creates fear and anxiety because you feel you can't control your environment. And most of us, frankly, artificially feel we can control our environment, which is completely untrue anyway. But the fact that you have routines that seemingly make you feel in control is comforting. So I think that the present situation for many is creating this fear and anxiety and this uncertainty. And I think there are two opportunities here. One is to recognize that how you respond to these different events is your choice. And you can look at the world, and frankly, as an example, prior to this pandemic, half of the world lived on less than $2.50 a day. And if you really think about that, most of us are in privileged positions. And I'm not trying to diminish the fact that people have lost their jobs, or maybe some are even hungry. But for most people, this is an opportunity to try to overcome that fear, because when you overcome that fear, it allows you to see things more clearly and see other opportunities and potential. Again, of course, there are certain situations here which are horrible for people, and I cannot diminish that fact by magically saying, oh, it's all going to be okay. Frankly, it may not be okay. Somebody may lose a loved one. Somebody may lose their job, and it's horribly unfortunate. That being said, those of us who are privileged and are fortunate, and hopefully this includes people in government, recognize that we have an opportunity to help others, and that really should be our first response to this degree of suffering. How can we come together as a world to help those who are suffering? Now, of course, this is an opportunity that's present every day before this pandemic started, but I hope that this places a lens on this situation where we look at the other as ourselves and reach out to help.
I just want to thank you so much for your time today.
Well, thank you. Yes, thank you. And again, regardless of our position, we cannot forget that regardless, there are others who are much, much worse off than us. And I think if you keep that in mind, it allows you to understand that you're blessed, and hopefully that even in the worst of circumstances, we can still reach out to others to connect with them and make their life a little better. And sometimes it's simply a smile or a hand.
Fantastic. James, I'm going to go and clap for the NHS. Happy Easter. Enjoy your weekend. Thank you.
Okay. Hey, thanks again.
Bye, buddy.